We have so far discussed the passage in the first Varga, which describes the climate of Aryan. The passage, even when taken by itself, is quite intelligible on the Arctic theory. But in ascertaining the original climate of Aryan, we supposed that it was the reverse of the one introduced by the invasion of Angra. The second Varga of the Venidad, which is similar in character to the first, contains, however, a passage which does away with the necessity of such assumptions by giving us a graphic description of the actual advent of ice and snow, which ruined the ancient Iranian paradise. This Varga is really a supplement to the first and contains a more detailed account of the Aryan and description of the life of paradise enjoyed there before Angra inflicted it with the plague of winter and snow. This is evident from the fact that the coming of severe winter is foretold in this Varga, and Yima is warned to prepare against it, while in the first Varga the happy land is described as actually ruined by Angra invasion. Darmestader divides this Varga into two parts, the first comprising the first 20 or so paragraphs, which according to Spiegel is 41, and the second the remaining portion of the Varga. In the first part, Ahura Mazda is said to have asked King Yima, the ruler of Aryan, who was called famous in Aryan, to receive the law from Mazda. But Yima refused to become the bearer of the law, and he was therefore directed by Ahura Mazda to keep his people happy and make them increase. Yima is accordingly represented as making men thrive and increase by keeping away death and disease from them, and by thrice enlarging the boundaries of the country which had become too narrow for its inhabitants. Whether this fact represents a gradual expansion of the oldest Aryan settlements in the Arctic home, we need not stop to inquire. The second part of the Varga opens with a meeting of the celestial gods, called by Ahura Mazda, and the fair Yima, the good shepherd of high renown in Aryan, is said to have tended this meeting with all his excellent mortals. It was at this meeting that Yima is distinctly warned by Ahura Mazda that fatal winters were going to fall on the happy land and destroy everything therein. To provide against this calamity, the Holy One advised Yima to make a vara, or enclosure, and remove to there the seeds of every kind of animals and plants for preservation. Yima made this vara accordingly, and the Varga informs us that in this vara the sun, the moon, and the stars rose but once a year, and that a year seemed only as a day to the inhabitants thereof. The Varga then closes with the description of the happy life led by the inhabitants of this Vara, of which Zarathustra and his son Uvatanara are said to be the masters or overseers. Yima's Vara, here described as something like a Noah's Ark, but there is a difference between the two, that while the biblical deluge is of water and rain, the Avestic deluge is of snow and ice. The latter does not only conflict with geological evidence, but is, on the contrary, fully and unexpectedly confirmed by it. Secondly, a description that a year seemed only as a day to the inhabitants of this Vara, the sun and stars rose only once a year therein, serves, in an unmistakable manner, to fix the geographical position of this Vara in the region around about the North Pole. For nowhere on the surface of the earth can we have a year-long day and night, except at the pole. Once the position of Yima's Vara is thus fixed, the position of Aryan is at once determined, for Yima's Vara, as stated, must obviously be located in the Aryan. Here is, therefore, another argument for locating Aryan in the extreme north and not to the west of ancient Iran, as others have done. For whether Yima's Vara be real or mythical, we cannot suppose that the knowledge of a year-long day and of a single rising of the sun during the whole year was acquired simply by a stretch of imagination, and it was a mere accident that it tallies so well with the description of the polar night and day. The authors of the Varga may not have themselves witnessed this phenomenon, but there can be no doubt that they knew these facts through tradition, and if so, we suppose that their remote ancestors must have acquired this knowledge by personal experience, in their home near the North Pole. Those that locate Aryan in the extreme east of the Iranian highland try to account for 10 months' winter therein by assuming that a tradition of a decrease in the Earth's temperature was still in the mind of the author of this Fargud, or that the rise of the tablelands, where the Oxus and the Chaxardis take their rise, is by far higher in ancient times than at present, thereby producing a cold climate. Both these explanations are artificial and unsatisfactory. It is true that the high altitude produces cold climate, but in the present instance the climate of Aryan was mild and genial before the invasion of Angra Mainyu, and we must therefore suppose the Iranian tableland was not elevated at first until Angra Mainyu upheaved it and produced it a cold climate. The present altitude of the plateau is not so great as to produce a winter of 10 months. This requires us again to assume the submergence of this land after the invasion of Angra Mainyu. Fortunately, though, there is no geological evidence forthcoming to support the upheaval and submergence of this land in the order mentioned. But even were such evidence forthcoming, the explanation would still fail to account why the inhabitants of Yemasvara in the Aryan regarded a year as a single day, a description which is true only at the North Pole. All attempts to locate the primitive Aryan in a region other than the circumpolar countries must therefore be abandoned. The names of mythical rivers and countries may have been transferred in later times to real terrestrial rivers and provinces, but if we were to settle the position of the primitive rivers or countries by reference to these new names, we can well locate Aryan between the Himalaya and the Vindhya mountains in India, for in later Sanskrit literature, the land lying between these two mountains is called Aryavarta, or the abode of the Aryans. A mistake committed by Darmestater and Spiegel is of the same kind. Instead of determining the position of Aryan from the fact that a winter of 10 months is said to have been introduced therein by Angra Mainyu, and that a year seemed to be only as a day to the inhabitants thereof, they try to guess it from uncertain data furnished by the names of rivers in Iran, though they were aware of the fact that the names were originally the names of mythical rivers, and were attached to these real rivers in Iran only in later times, when a branch of the ancient race went over to and settled in that country. Naturally enough, this introduced greater confusion into the account of Aryan instead of elucidating it, and scholars try to get out of it by supposing that the whole account is either mythical or is, at best, a confused reminiscence of the ancient Iranian home. The recent scientific discoveries, however, prove the correctness of Avestic traditions, and the light thrown on the subject by new materials. There is no course left but to reject the erroneous speculations of those Zen scholars that make Aryan the easternmost boundary of Iran. But the most important part of the second Fargud is the warning conveyed by Ahura Mazda to Yima that fatal winters were going to fall in the land, and the description of glaciation by which the happy land was to be ruined. The warning is in the form of a prophecy, but anyone who reads the two Farguds carefully can see the passage really gives us the description of the glacial epoch witnessed by the ancestors of the Iranians. We'll study it as passages given by Darmestater and Spiegel.
And Ahura Mazda spake unto Yima, saying, O fair Yima, son of divine God, upon the mercurial world the fatal winters are going to fall, that shall bring the fierce foul frost. Upon the mercurial world the fatal winters are going to fall, that shall make snowflakes fall thick, even are very deep in the highest tops of the mountains. And all the three sorts of beasts shall perish, those that live in the wilderness, those that live in the top of the mountains, and those that live in the bosom of the gale, under the shelter of stables. Before that winter, those fields would bear plenty of grass for cattle. Now, with floods that stream, with snows that melt, it will seem a happy land in the world, the land wherein footprints even of sheep may still be seen. Therefore make thee Avara, long as a riding ground, on every side of the square, and hither bring the seeds of sheep and oxen, of men, of dogs, of birds, and of red blazing fires. Then spake Ahura Mazda to Yima, Yima the fair son of Givano, upon the corporeal world will an evil of winter come. Wherefore of even destroying frost will arise, upon the corporeal world will the evil of winter come. Wherefore snow will fall in great abundance, on the summits of the mountains, on the breadths of the height. From 3 places, O Yima, let the cattle depart, if they are in the most fearful places. If they are on the tops of mountains, if they are in the depths of valleys, depart to a secure dwelling place. Before this winter the fields would bear plenty of country-produced pasture, grass for cattle now with. Before flow waters, behind floods that strain with the melting of snow. Clouds, O Yima, will come over the inhabited regions, which now behold the feet of greater and smaller cattle. Therefore make thou a circle of the length of a race ground to all 4 corners, and hither bring thou the seed of the cattle, and the beasts of burden, of men, and of dogs, of birds, and of red burning fires.
Can anything we ask be more clear or distinct than the above description of the advent of the glacial epoch in the happy land, over which Yima ruled, and where a year was equivalent to a single day? There is no reference to Angra Mainyu in this passage, which describes in the form of a prophecy the evils of glaciation, which must, in the same manner as modern geologists would describe the process of the ice cap during the glacial period. Ahura Mazda tells Yima that fierce and foul frost will fall on the material world, and even the tops of the highest mountains will be covered with, or rather buried in snow, which will destroy all living beings, whether in the tops of the mountains or the valleys below. The snow, it is said, would fall an deep, which Spiegel translates by the phrase, in great abundance, while Darmestader, quoting from the commentary, explains in a footnote that even where the snow is least, it will be 1 vitatsi, 2 fingers, that is, 14 fingers deep. A cubit of snow at the lowest, covering the highest tops of the mountains and the lowest depths of the valley alike, cannot but destroy all animal life. We do not think the beginning of the Ice Age can be more vividly described. With this express passage before us, ascribing the ruin of the happy land, we should have no difficulty whatsoever in rightly interpreting the meaning of the invasion of Angra Mainyu, described in the beginning of the first Fargad. It is no longer a matter of inference that the original genial climate of Aryan was rendered inclement by the invasion of winter and snow, afterwards introduced into the land. The above passage says so in distinct terms, and the description is so graphic that we cannot regard it as mythical or imaginary. Add to it the fact that geological discoveries have established the existence of at least 2 glacial periods, the last of which closed, and the post-glacial period commenced, according to American geologists, not later than about 8000 BCE, when the Avestic traditions regarding the destruction of the primeval Arctic home by glaciation is thus found to be complete in harmony with the latest geological researches. There's no reason except prejudice why we should not regard the Avestic account as a correct reminiscence of an old, real, historical fact. The author of the Fargads in question cannot be supposed to have given us by imagination such a graphic account of a phenomenon which is brought to light or discovered by scientists only in the past decades. Darmester, in his translation of the Fargads, observes in a footnote that the account of glaciation is a result of a mythical misunderstanding by which winter was thought to be the counter-creation of Iran Ve. This passed off very well just decades ago, but the phenomenon of glaciation in the Ice Age is now better understood, and we cannot accept guesses or conjectures of scholars regarding the meaning of a passage in the Avesta which describes the glaciation of an Iranian paradise. It only proves how the ancient records, howsoever express or distinct they may be, are apt to be misunderstood and misinterpreted, owing to imperfect knowledge of the climatic and other conditions or surroundings. amongst which the ancestors of our race lived in remote ages. But for such a misunderstanding, it is not difficult to perceive that the Aryan Aveho, or the original home of the Aryan race, was situated near the North Pole, and that the ancestors of the ancient race abandoned it not out of irresistible impulse or overcrowding, but simply because it was ruined by the invasion of snow and ice brought on by the glacial epoch. In short, the Avestic tradition, as recorded in this Fargad, is the oldest documentary evidence of the great climatic convulsion, which took place several hundreds of years ago, and the scientific evidence of which was discovered only during the last decades. It's therefore a matter of regret that the importance of this tradition should have been so long misunderstood and overlooked. It can be seen from our earlier discussions that the traditional evidence preserved in the first two Fargads of the Venidad is especially important for our purpose. The dawn hymns of the Rig Veda supply us with the evidence of a long continuous dawn of 30 days in the ancient home, and there are passages in the Vedas which speak of long continuous night of 6 months, or shorter duration, and a year of 7 or 10 months. This can also be shown that several Vedic myths and deities bear an unmistakable stamp of their Arctic origin. But as we noted before, in the whole Vedic literature, there's no passage which will enable us to determine the time when the polar regions were inhabited, or to ascertain the reason why they were abandoned. For that purpose, we drew upon geology, which has recently established the fact that the climate of the circumpolar regions, which is now so cold as to render the land unsuited for human habitation, was mild and genial before the last glacial period. It followed, therefore, that if the Vedic evidence pointed to an Arctic home, the forefathers of the Aryan race must have lived therein not after but before the last glacial epoch. But the traditions preserved in the Avesta dispense with the necessity of relying on geology for this purpose. We now have direct traditional evidence to show that Aryan Aveho originally had a good climate, but that Angramanyu converted it to winter of 10 and summer of 2 months. That Aryan Aveho was so situated that the inhabitants of Yimasvara therein regarded a year only as a day, and saw the sun rise only once a year, and that the happy land was rendered uninhabitable by the advent of a glacial epoch, which destroyed all life therein. It is true that, but for recent geological discoveries, these statements, howsoever plain and distinct, would have remained unintelligible or regarded as improbable by scholars, who would have always tried, as Darmestader has already done, to put some artificial or unnatural construction upon these passages to render the same comprehensible to them. Cannot, therefore, deny that we are indebted to these scientific discoveries for enabling us to determine the true meaning of the Avestic traditions, and to clear the mist of a misinterpretation that has gathered round them. But nevertheless, the value of this traditional testimony is not thereby impaired in any way. It is the oldest traditional record, preserved by human memory, of a great catastrophe which overtook the northern portion of Europe and Asia in ancient times, and obliged those ancient inhabitants of the Arctic regions to migrate southwards. It has been preserved during thousands of years simply as an ancient record or tradition, though its meaning was not intelligible, until, at last, we now see that the accuracy of the recount is fully and unexpectedly borne out by scientific researches. There are few instances where science has proven the accuracy of ancient semi-religious records in this way. When the position of the Aryan Aveho and the cause of its ruin are thus definitely settled, both by traditional and scientific evidence, it naturally follows that the 16 lands mentioned in the first Fargad of the Venidad must be taken to mark the gradual diffusion of the Iranians from their ancient home to the country of Rasa and the 7 rivers, or in other words, the Fargad must be regarded as historical, not geographical, as maintained by Spiegel and Darmestader. It is true the first Fargad does not say anything about migration, but when the site of the Aryana Veho is placed in the extreme north, and when we are told of the second Fargad that the land was ruined by ice, no specific mention of migration is needed, and the fact that the 16 lands are mentioned in a certain specific order is then naturally understood, in that case to mark the successive stages of migration of the Indo-Iranian people. It's not contended that every word in the two Fargads may be historically correct. No one would expect such a rigid accuracy in the reminiscence of old times traditionally preserved. It's also true that the Aryan Aveho has grown into a sort of mythical land in later Parsi literature, somewhat like Mount Meru, the seat of Hindu gods, in the Puranas. But for all that, we cannot deny that in the account of the Aryan Aveho, in the first two Fargads of Venedad, we have a real historical reminiscence of the Arctic cradle of the Iranian, or the Aryan race, and that Fargad gives us a description of the countries through which the Indo-Iranians had to pass before they settled in Hapta Hindu, or on the floods of Ranga, at the beginning of the post-glacial period. This story of the destruction of the original home by ice may well be compared to the story of the deluge found in Indian literature. The oldest of these accounts is contained in the Shaptatha Brahmana. The same story is also found with modifications and additions in the Mahabharata and in the Matsya, the Bhagavata, and other Puranas. All these passages are collected and discussed by Muir in the first volume of his original Sanskrit texts. It's not necessary to examine them here with any length. We're concerned only with the Vedic version of the story, and this appears in the above-mentioned passage in the Shaptatha Brahmana. A fish is represented as having fallen into the hands of Manu, along with water brought for washing in the morning. The fish asked Manu to save him, and in return promised to rescue Manu from a flood that would sweep away all creatures. Brahmana does not say when and where this conversation took place, nor describe the nature of the calamity more fully than that it was a flood. Manu preserved the fish first in a jar, then in a trench, and lastly by carrying him to the ocean. The fish then warns Manu that in such and such a year, which is not definitely specified, a destructive flood will come, and advises him to construct a ship and embark in it when the flood would arise. Manu constructs the ship accordingly, and when the flood rises, embarks in it, fastening its cable to the fish's horn, and passes over to this northern mountain, by which phrase the commentator understands to be the Himavat, or the Himalaya mountain, to the north of India. The fish then asks Manu to fasten the ship to a tree so that it may gradually descend without growing astray along with the subsiding water, and Manu acts accordingly. We are told that it is on this account that the northern mountain has received the appellation Manu's descent. Manu was the only person thus saved from the deluge, and desirous of offspring, he sacrificed with the Pakayanya and threw butter, milk, and curds as oblations into the waters, and thence, in a year, rose a woman named Ida, and Manu, living with her, begot the offspring, which is called Manu's offspring. This is the substance of the story found in the Shaptatha Brahmana, and the same incident is apparently referred to in the Arthaveda Samhita, which says that the Kushtha parent was born on the very spot on the summit of the Himavat, the seat of the gliding down of the ship, the golden ship with the golden tackle that moved through the heavens. In the Mahabharata version of this legend, the peak of the Himalaya is said to be known as Nau Bandhanam, but no further details regarding the place or the time are given. The Matsya Purana, however, mentions Malaya, or the Malabar, as the scene of Manu's austerity, and in the Bhagavata, Satyavada, king of Dravidia, is said to be the hero of the story. Muir has compared these accounts and pointed out the differences between the oldest and the later versions of the story, showing how it had been amplified and enlarged in later times. But we are, however, concerned with the oldest account, and so far as it goes, it gives us no clue for determining the place where Manu embarked on his ship. The deluge, again, appears to be one of water, not of ice and snow, as described in the Avesta, Nevertheless, it seems the Indian story of the deluge refers to the same catastrophe as described in the Avesta, and not any local deluge of water or rain. For though the Shaptatha Brahmana mentions only a flood, the other word used, which Panini describes from pralaya, a deluge, signifies snow, frost, or ice in later Sanskrit literature. This does indicate a connection of ice with the deluge, was not originally unknown to the Indians, though in later times it seems to have been entirely overlooked. Geology informs us that every glacial epoch is characterized by extensive inundation of the land with waters brought down by great rivers flowing from the glaciated districts and carrying an amount of sand or mud along with them. The word for flood used in the Shapta Brahmana may therefore be taken to refer to those sweeping floods flowing from the glaciated districts, and we may then suppose Manu to have been carried along with one of these in a ship, guided by the fish, to the side of the Himalayan mountains. In short, it's not necessary to hold the account that the Shaptatha Brahmana refers to a water deluge, pure and simple, whatever the latter Puranas may say. If so, we can regard the Brahmic account of the deluge as but a different version of the Avestic deluge of ice. It was once suggested the idea of the deluge may have been introduced into India from an exclusively Semitic source. This theory is long ago abandoned by scholars, as the story of the deluge is found in such an ancient book as the Shaptatha Brahmana, the date of which has now been ascertained to be no later than 2500 BCE, from the fact that it expressly assigns to the Krityas or the Pleiades a position in due east. It's evident, therefore, that the story of the deluge is Aryan in origin, and that the case of the Avestic and the Vedic account of the deluge must be traced to the same source. It may also be remarked that Yima, who is said to have constructed the Vara in the Avesta, is there described as the son of Vivangat, and Manu, the hero of the Indian story, though he receives no epithet in the account of the deluge in Shapta Brahmana, is very often described in Vedic literature as the son of Vivasvat, who is the Iranian Vivangat. Yama is expressly called Vivasvat in Rig Veda. This shows that in spite of the fact that Yima is the hero in one account and Manu in the other, that one is said to be the deluge of ice and the other of water, we may regard the two accounts as referring to the same geological phenomenon. The Avestic account is, however, more specific than that in the Shapta Brahmana, and as it is corroborated almost in every detail by the scientific evidence regarding the advent of the glacial epoch in early times, it follows the tradition preserved in the two Fargads of the Vedas is older than that in the Shapata Brahmana. As a side note, the story of the deluge is also found in other Aryan mythologies. This following extract from Grote's History of Greece gives the Greek version of the story. Some of the incidents therein bear striking resemblance to the incidents in the story of Manu. The enormous iniquity with which the earth was contaminated, as Apollodorus says, by the then existing brazen race, or as others say, by the 50 monstrous sons of Lycano, provoked Zeus to send a general deluge. An unremitting and terrible rain laid the whole of Greece under water, except the highest mountaintops, wherein a few stragglers found refuge. Deucalion was saved in a chest or ark, with which he had been forewarned by his father Prometheus to construct. After floating for 9 days on the water, he at length landed on the summit of Mount Parnassus. Zeus, having sent Hermes to him, promised to grant whatever he asked. He prayed that men and companions might be sent to him in his solitude, and accordingly Zeus directed both him and Pyrrha, his wife, to cast stones over their heads. Those cast by Pyrrha became women, those by Deucalion men, and thus the stony race of men, if we may be allowed to translate an etymology which the Greek language presents exactly, and which has not been disdained by Hesiod, Pindar, Epicharmus, or by Virgil. The stony race of men came to tenant the soil of Greece. Deucalion, on landing from the ark, sacrificed a grateful offering to Zeus Phykios, or the god of escape. He also erected altars in Thessaly to the 12 great gods of Olympus. In commenting upon the above story, Grote remarks that the reality of the deluge was firmly believed throughout the historical ages of Greece, and even Aristotle, in his meteorological work, admits and reasons upon it as unquestionable fact. Dr. Hogg arrived at a similar conclusion, that the 2 Fargads of the Venidad is older than that of the Shapatha Brahmana on linguistic grounds. Speaking about the passage in the Venidad, he says, "The original document is certainly of high antiquity and undoubtedly one of the oldest of the pieces which compose the existing Venidad." The mention of Haptahendu, a name not preserved in latter Vedic literature, was also said to point to the same conclusion. We may here refer to certain passages cited by Muir in his original Sanskrit text, to show the reminiscence of the northern home may have been preserved in Indian literature. He first refers to the expression Shatam Himna, or 100 winters, occurring in several places in Rig Veda, and remarks that though the expression Sharad Shatam, or 100 autumns, also occurs in Rig Veda, yet Shatam Hima may be regarded as a relic of the period when the recollection of colder regions from which the Vedic ancients migrated had not yet been entirely forgotten. The second passage quoted by him is from the Aitareya Brahmana, which says, "Wherefore, in this northern region, all people who dwell beyond the Himavat, called the Uttara Kurus and the Uttara Madras, are consecrated to the glorious rule." The Uttara Kurus are again described in the same Brahmana as the land of gods which no mortal may conquer, showing the country had come to be regarded as the domain of mythology. The Uttara Kurus are mentioned in the Ramayana as the abode of those who performed the meritorious works, and in the Mahabharata, Arjun is told, "Here are the Uttara Kurus, whom no one attempts to combat." That the Uttara Kurus were not a fabulous land is shown by the fact that a mountain, a people, and a city called Ottaracora is mentioned by Ptolemy. Lawson thinks that Megasthenes had the Uttara Kurus in view when he referred to the Hyperboreans. Moore concludes his section with a passage from the Sankayana, or the Kaushitaki Brahmana, where Pathya Svati, or the goddess of speech, is said to know the northern region, and we are told that hence in the northern region speech is better known and better spoken, and it is in the north that men go to learn speech. Muir thinks that some faint reminiscence of an early connection to the north can be traced through these passages, but none of them are conclusive, nor have we any indication therein of the original home being in the Arctic regions, as we have in the case of the Vedic passages discussed previously, which speak of a long continuous dawn and night, or of a year of 10 months. We may, however, take the passages cited by Muir as corroborative evidence. They've been referred to here in that same light. It's upon these Vedic passages and legends examined in previous videos and Avestic evidence discussed here that we mainly rely on for establishing the existence of the primeval ancient home in the Arctic. And when both these are taken together, we get direct testimony for holding that the original home of the Aryan races was situated near the North Pole, not in Central Asia, that it was destroyed by the advent of the glacial epoch, and the Indo-Aryans, who were compelled to leave the country, migrated southwards, passing through several provinces of Central Asia and eventually settling in the valley of the Oxus, the Indus, the Kubha, and the Rasa, from which region we see them again migrating, the Indians to the east, the Persians to the west, at the early dawn of latter traditional history.